The man in the charcoal brioni suit leaned back in his chair, as if the courtroom belonged to him. Not just a seat, not just a table. The air. He crossed one leg over the other, adjusted the platinum watch at his wrist, and let out a low, amused breath that carried just far enough for people nearby to hear. It wasn't laughter. It was worse than that. It was confidence without effort, the kind that assumes victory has already happened. Ethan Caldwell didn't look at his wife. He didn't need to. The empty chair beside her was doing the work for him. Federal Plaza Courthouse, Lower Manhattan. Courtroom 14B, 9th floor. Fluorescent lights humming softly above rows of wooden benches polished by decades of other people's losses. The seal of the state of New York hung behind the judge's bench, gold leaf catching the light like a warning. Ethan glanced at his attorney, Richard Hale, a senior partner from a midtown firm known for moving quietly and destroying loudly. Hale's tablet rested open on the desk, documents stacked in digital order like dominoes waiting to fall. Still no counsel, Ethan murmured, eyes flicking toward the defense table. Richard didn't look up. We're early. Ethan smiled anyway. Across the aisle, his wife sat alone. Claire Caldwell folded her hands together in her lap, so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. She wore a navy blue dress she'd owned for years, the kind of thing that blended into walls. No jewelry, no laptop, no stack of files, no assistant leaning in to whisper strategy. Just her. She stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, breathing slow, controlled, as if any sudden movement might shatter something inside her. The chair to her right was empty, intentionally. Ethan had made sure of that. 2 weeks earlier, he'd frozen the joint accounts. 3 days after that, the card stopped working. The week after, the credit line vanished. And yesterday morning, the courier arrived with a sealed notice terminating access to the trust attorney they'd once shared. Clean, legal, surgical. Richard Hale had called it positioning. Ethan called it inevitability. She looked smaller, Ethan said, not bothering to lower his voice. A few heads in the gallery turned. Richard finally looked up. Focus. I am focused. Ethan adjusted his cufflinks. This is focus. The bailiff's voice cut through the room. All rise. Chairs scraped back. Shoes shifted. The murmur died instantly. Judge Margaret Holloway entered with the measured pace of someone who had seen too much to be impressed by anything anymore. Mid-50s. Steel gray hair pulled into a tight knot. Reading glasses already perched low on her nose. She sat, looked down, adjusted a folder. Be seated. The room complied. Judge Holloway scanned the docket briefly, then lifted her eyes. Case number 22 to 4876. Caldwell versus Caldwell. Preliminary hearing on asset division and spousal support. Her gaze moved to Ethan's side of the room. Counsel? Richard stood smoothly. Richard Hale for the plaintiff. Your Honor. We're ready to proceed. The judge nodded once, then turned to the other table. And the defendant? Claire rose slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Holloway paused. Her eyes flicked briefly to the empty chair beside Claire, then back to her face. Miss Caldwell, I don't see counsel with you. They're on their way, Claire said. Her voice didn't crack. But it wasn't strong either. The pause that followed stretched just long enough for the room to feel it. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Judge Holloway tilted her head slightly. Court began 10 minutes ago. Yes, Your Honor. Silence. Ethan let out a short, incredulous laugh. Not loud enough to be disrespectful, just loud enough to be heard. Judge Holloway's eyes snapped to him. Is there something you'd like to share, Mr. Caldwell? Ethan stood. He buttoned his jacket as if this were a board meeting. No, Your Honor. I find the situation unfortunate. My wife has had months to prepare. I offered to make this easy. He turned slightly, gesturing toward Claire without looking directly at her. She declined counsel, declined settlement, declined reality. I'm concerned the court's time is being wasted. Richard placed a hand on Ethan's arm, not to stop him, to steady the optics. Judge Holloway's expression didn't change. Ms. Caldwell, she said, are you representing yourself today? Claire swallowed. No, Your Honor. Then where's your attorney? Claire's eyes flicked, just for a moment, toward the doors at the back of the courtroom. They'll be here. Ethan shook his head slowly, almost sympathetically. Your Honor, he said, if I may. Judge Holloway hesitated, then nodded. Ethan took a step forward. My wife has no income, no access to funds, no retainer. She refused the settlement I offered last week, $75,000 in the townhouse in Brooklyn Heights. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Ethan continued, voice calm, reasonable. She believed this will turn into something dramatic. It won't. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I don't want her to embarrass herself further. Claire's jaw tightened. Ethan looked at her now, for the first time. There's no lawyer coming, Claire. Judge Holloway's gavel came down once. Sharp. Mr. Caldwell. My apologies, Ethan said immediately. I only meant. Enough. She turned back to Claire. Ms. Caldwell, the court can grant a brief continuance if you have retained counsel and they are delayed. But I need clarity. Claire inhaled slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Another pause. Ethan's confidence settled deeper, heavier. He had planned this moment. He knew how it would look. A woman alone at the defense table. No files. No attorney. No leverage. He imagined the headlines already fading before they were written. Richard leaned in slightly. If she proceeds pro se, he whispered, we move immediately. Ethan nodded almost imperceptibly. Judge Holloway glanced at the clock mounted on the wall. Miss Caldwell, I will allow 5 more minutes. 5 minutes. Ethan exhaled. 5 minutes was an eternity for someone with nothing. Claire remained standing, hands clasped in front of her. The room settled into a tense quiet. No footsteps echoed from the hallway. No doors opened. Ethan smiled to himself. This was where she broke. This was where she realized silence wasn't strength. It was absence. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. Richard straightened. Your Honor, he said smoothly. Given the circumstances, we respectfully move to proceed. Judge Holloway looked at Claire one more time. Claire's gaze never left the back of the room. For minutes, Ethan checked his watch. 5. Judge Holloway reached for her gavel. And then the doors opened. Not slowly, not cautiously. They opened fully, decisively, the sound cutting through the court. Ethan turned last. And in that fraction of a second, before he could process what he was seeing, something unfamiliar crept into his chest. Not fear, confusion. A woman stood in the doorway, late 60s, maybe early 70s. Straight-backed, unhurried. She wore a white tailored suit that didn't announce wealth. It assumed it. No jewelry beyond a thin gold band on one finger. Her hair, silver and precise, was cut sharp enough to look intentional from any angle. She removed her sunglasses slowly. The courtroom didn't breathe. Behind her, 2 younger attorneys followed, each carrying a leather briefcase, each moving with a kind of discipline that came from long exposure to serious power. The woman walked down the aisle. Her heels struck the floor in a measured rhythm, not rushed, not apologetic. Ethan felt the room change before he understood why. Richard Hale's face had gone pale. No, Richard whispered. Ethan frowned. What? The woman reached the defense table. She didn't look at Claire. She didn't look at the judge. She turned to Ethan and smiled. Apologies for the delay, she said, voice calm, perfectly modulated. Traffic from D.C. was heavier than expected. Judge Holloway leaned forward. Counsel, she said, state your name for the record. The woman placed a card on the clerk's desk. Margaret Whitmore, she said. Senior Managing Partner, Whitmore and Ellison, Washington, D.C. She turned slightly, placing one hand on the back of Claire's chair. And I'm here on behalf of my daughter. Ethan's smile vanished. Not slowly. Instantly. The first flashback landed, silent, unannounced. Years earlier. A dinner table. Claire quiet. Ethan speaking for both of them. A voice on the phone afterward, calm and distant, warning Claire to be careful who she trusted. Ethan had dismissed it. The courtroom was silent. Judge Holloway's gavel rested untouched in her hand. "Proceed," the judge said. And for the first time that morning, Ethan realized the room no longer belonged to him. Ethan Caldwell sat perfectly still, but his body had already begun to betray him. It was in the shallow tension at the corners of his mouth, the way his fingers touched his watch again, not to check the time, just to remind himself of something solid, the way his eyes flicked once toward Richard Hale, searching for instruction like a man hearing a language he didn't expect in his own home. Richard didn't give him a look. Richard was staring at Margaret Whitmore the way a pilot stares at an unexpected storm cell on radar. Judge Holloway's voice cut through the silence. "Ms. Whitmore, you're admitted in New York?" Margaret didn't blink. "Yes, Your Honor. New York, D.C., California, and federal." The judge nodded once, as if that alone explained the shift in the air. Margaret set her briefcase on the defense table and opened it with 2 clean snaps. The younger attorneys behind her moved in perfect alignment, one sliding a folder across, the other taking a seat a step back like a security detail that understood the value of patience. Claire remained seated, but something about her posture had changed. She looked like she was still bracing herself. Only now, she was bracing for impact that wasn't aimed at her. Ethan's voice came out lower than he intended. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." Judge Holloway's eyes moved to him. "Mr. Caldwell, you don't decide what's irregular in my courtroom." Ethan swallowed. Richard stood. "Your Honor, if I may, we were prepared to proceed under the assumption the defendant was unrepresented. We filed a motion." "I read your motion," Margaret said, and it was an interruption. It was dismissal. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, before we address opposing counsel's attempt to proceed by default, I'm entering my appearance as counsel for the defendant, effective immediately." Judge Holloway's gaze settled on Claire. "Ms. Caldwell, is this your counsel?" Claire's throat moved. "Yes, Your Honor." Ethan stared at her, then at Margaret. "You're her mother?" he asked, a harsh edge slipping through. Margaret finally looked at Claire. Not warmly, not tenderly. Just long enough of the courtroom to understand that this wasn't a sentimental rescue. "This is not a family reunion," Margaret said. "This is a legal emergency." The words were quiet, controlled, and somehow they landed harder than shouting. A murmur rippled across the gallery. People leaned forward instinctively, as if they could feel something historic forming. Judge Holloway tapped her pen once on the file. "Proceed, Ms. Whitmore." Margaret stood. She did not walk to the podium. She walked to the center of the room, just far enough that every juror I could see her clearly. Then she turned slightly so she could speak to the judge while still facing Ethan. "Your Honor, opposing counsel's motion for default judgment is premature and, frankly, opportunistic." Richard Hale's jaw tightened. Margaret continued. "The plaintiff created the circumstances he now seeks to exploit." Ethan's face tightened. "That's not." Judge Holloway's eyes sharpened. "Mr. Caldwell, don't." Margaret's voice remained even. "In the last 14 days, Mr. Caldwell has frozen marital accounts, terminated access to shared legal resources, and attempted to restrict my client's ability to secure counsel by strangling liquidity." Richard raised a hand. "Your Honor, marital asset freezes." Margaret didn't look at him. "May be legal. They are not neutral." She reached into her briefcase and removed a binder so thick it looked exaggerated until it hit the defense table with a heavy, deliberate thud. The sound echoed. The gallery flinched. Ethan's eyes moved to the binder like it was a threat. Margaret opened it. "Your Honor, Exhibit A." She held up a bank notice. The emergency motion to freeze joint assets was filed Monday, but the affidavit supporting that motion contains a statement that is objectively false. Richard's posture shifted. "We'd need to see." "You will," Margaret said, and slid a copy toward him without breaking rhythm. Ethan leaned forward. "What are you talking about?" Margaret's eyes met his for the first time. Mr. Caldwell declared to this court that the accounts were frozen to preserve marital assets from dissipation. Ethan's throat tightened. Margaret's voice didn't rise. It got quieter. However, on the same day those accounts were frozen, Mr. Caldwell initiated a wire transfer from a corporate holding account into an offshore entity under a name that does not appear on his disclosure forms. A second binder landed on the table. Heavier. Thud. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. Judge Holloway leaned forward. Offshore entity? Margaret flipped a page with one finger. Yes, Your Honor. A holding company registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Northwind Capital Group. Richard Hale's face tightened with something that looked like calculation and fear mixed together. Ethan's voice came out sharp. That's not marital money. That's company money. Margaret turned slowly. Do you want to testify to that under oath, Mr. Caldwell? Silence. The judge's eyes stayed on Ethan. Ethan looked away first. Margaret returned her gaze to the bench. Your Honor, my team pulled these records overnight. Not because we enjoy theatrics, but because the plaintiff's behavior suggests a pattern of concealment. She took another folder and slid it forward. And because your docket is crowded, I'm going to be respectful and efficient. The word efficient landed like a warning. Margaret continued. There is a prenuptial agreement referenced in the filings. Ethan's confidence tried to reassemble itself. Yes, he said too quickly. It's ironclad. She signed it. She gets nothing. Claire's hands tightened in her lap. Margaret didn't react. Mr. Caldwell, she said calmly, do you know who authored the coercion standards used in this state's marital contract law? Ethan blinked. What? Margaret's eyes didn't leave him. I did. A low stir in the gallery. The bailiff glanced toward the bench as if to confirm he'd heard correctly. Margaret held up a printed statute with highlighted sections. In 2004, I worked as special counsel on the committee that drafted the updated language defining coercion in marital agreements under New York law. Ethan's breath caught. Margaret's tone stayed almost conversational. And as of 6:41 a.m. this morning, I filed a motion to invalidate the prenuptial agreement on the grounds of coercion, financial deception, and duress. Richard Hale snapped up. Your Honor, we haven't been served. Judge Holloway held up a hand. Mr. Hale, if the motion is on file, you'll receive it. Margaret turned another page. My client provided a sworn affidavit that the night before the wedding, Mr. Caldwell threatened to cut off her access to her grandmother's assisted living care unless she signed. Claire's throat tightened, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Ethan stood up abruptly. That's a lie. Judge Holloway's gavel came down once. Sit. Down. Ethan stayed standing for half a second too long. The bailiff shifted. Ethan sat. Margaret didn't flinch. And, she continued, my associates recovered text messages from that night. Messages Mr. Caldwell believed were deleted. They were not. She held up a printed screenshot. Exhibit C. Judge Holloway reached for the document. Her eyes scanned it. Her expression didn't change. But the air did. Ethan's jaw tightened. The pulse in his neck began to show. Richard leaned close to him and whispered something, but Ethan didn't hear it. Ethan was staring at the judge's face, trying to read whether this was still salvageable. Judge Holloway set the document down slowly. Mr. Hale, she said, voice controlled, your client's disclosures are now in question. Richard straightened. Your Honor, we object to the admission of this evidence without proper. Margaret spoke softly. You attempted to default a woman with no counsel while your client mocked her in open court. Her eyes moved toward Ethan, then back to Richard. You don't get to speak to me about fairness. A quiet sound, someone in the gallery exhaling hard. Filled the gap. Judge Holloway's gaze returned to Margaret. Ms. Whitmore, she said, tone cautious now. What is the defendant seeking today? Margaret closed the binder slowly, as if sealing a coffin. We're seeking 3 things, Your Honor. She raised one finger. First, an immediate protective order preventing the plaintiff from restricting access to necessary funds for legal representation. Second finger. Second, an emergency forensic audit of all assets, including corporate entities, trusts, offshore accounts, and digital holdings. Third finger. And third, we're seeking sanctions for the plaintiff's conduct in this court. Ethan's mouth moved. Sanctions? Margaret turned to him, and her voice dropped just enough to feel personal. You thought your wife having no lawyer was funny. Ethan's eyes narrowed. I didn't. Margaret's expression remained blank. I don't negotiate with people who enjoy cruelty. She turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I am not here to settle quickly. I am here to expose fully. Judge Holloway stared at Margaret for a moment, long enough for the room to understand that this judge wasn't just weighing arguments now. She was weighing consequences. Then she looked at Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, she said, voice low, is there anything in your disclosures you'd like to correct before we proceed? Ethan's throat worked. Richard shifted in his seat, like a man calculating whether his client was about to confess himself into a prison cell. Ethan's lips parted, and the second flashback hit. Mid-story timing, clean and cruel. A memory of Ethan standing in the kitchen months ago, laughing lightly as he told Claire, "You wouldn't survive one day without me handling everything." The memory wasn't there to explain. It was there to sentence. Ethan swallowed. No, he said, forcing steadiness. Judge Holloway's eyes held him. Very well. She looked back to Margaret. Proceed. Margaret nodded once, and for the first time placed a hand lightly on Claire's shoulder. Not a hug, a signal. Then she stood. Your Honor, she said, I call Ethan Caldwell as a hostile witness. Ethan froze. The courtroom didn't move. It didn't need to, because everyone understood the same thing at the same time. This was no longer a divorce hearing. It was a dismantling. Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a moment too long. It wasn't defiance. It was recalibration. He had spent his adult life reading rooms, reading people, reading leverage, boardrooms, deal tables, private dinners where decisions were made quietly and consequences were handled later out of sight. He understood pressure. He understood risk. What he didn't understand, what had just shifted beyond his control, was structure. Judge Holloway watched him without expression. Mr. Caldwell, she said, you've been called as a hostile witness. Please take the stand. Ethan stood. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Too loudly. A small sound, but the kind that announces nerves even when the mouth doesn't. Richard Hale leaned toward him, voice low and urgent. Answer exactly what's asked. Do not volunteer. Do not improvise. Ethan didn't respond. He buttoned his jacket again, unnecessarily, and walked to the witness stand with the measured steps of someone determined not to rush, even as his internal clock began to race. The bailiff administered the oath. Ethan raised his right hand, jaw set. I do. He sat. Margaret Whitmore didn't approach the podium. She stood where she was. This was deliberate. She didn't need height or distance. She needed line of sight. Mr. Caldwell, she began, voice even, you testified earlier that your wife declined counsel because she was irresponsible with money. Is that correct? Ethan nodded. She didn't want to prioritize. Yes or no? Yes. Margaret took a step closer. Is it also your testimony that you handled all marital finances because she was incapable of understanding them? Ethan hesitated, then nodded again. Yes. Margaret stopped moving. Mr. Caldwell, she said calmly, how long have you been the sole signatory on the joint accounts? Since around the second year of the marriage. So for approximately 5 years. Yes. And during that time, did you ever provide your wife with full access to financial statements? Ethan shifted in his seat. She wasn't interested. That wasn't my question. No. A faint murmur ran through the gallery. Margaret nodded once, as if confirming a number she already knew. Let's talk about Northwind Capital Group. Ethan's jaw tightened. Margaret continued without pause. You testified moments ago that Northwind Capital is a corporate holding entity unrelated to marital assets. Yes. Mr. Caldwell, she said, is Northwind Capital funded exclusively by revenue generated during your marriage? Ethan's lips pressed together. Yes. Then by definition, Margaret said gently, it is a marital asset. Richard Hale stood abruptly. Objection. Overruled. Judge Holloway said immediately, answer the question. Ethan swallowed. Yes. Margaret let that sit. Then, on March 14th of this year, she said. Did you authorize a transfer of $1.9 million from Northwind Capital into a private account held in the Cayman Islands? Ethan blinked. I don't recall the exact amount. That's not what I asked. Yes or no? Yes. Margaret nodded. Was your wife informed of this transfer? No. Was it disclosed in your financial affidavit submitted to this court? Ethan's voice dropped. No. The gallery was silent now. Not the bored silence from earlier, but the attentive kind. Phones had stopped moving. People leaned forward, without realizing they had. Margaret walked closer. Mr. Caldwell, she said, what was the purpose of that transfer? Ethan straightened. Confidence tried to reassert itself. It was strategic repositioning. Asset protection. From whom? From market volatility. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Or from your wife? Ethan opened his mouth, closed it. Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. Margaret continued. Let's discuss the prenuptial agreement. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Isn't it true, Margaret said, that the agreement was signed less than 12 hours before the wedding? Yes. And that the wedding was scheduled for following morning? Yes. And that at the time of signing, your wife did not have independent counsel present? She didn't ask for her. Yes or no? No. Margaret reached into her binder and removed a printed message. Mr. Caldwell, do you recognize this text? She held it up so the judge could see. Ethan stared at it. Yes. Would you like to read it aloud for court? Ethan's eyes flicked to Richard. Richard didn't look back. No. Judge Holloway leaned forward. Read it. Ethan swallowed. I wrote, if you don't sign tonight, don't bother showing up tomorrow. And don't expect me to keep paying for your grandmother's care. The words hung in the air. Claire's breath caught, but she didn't move. Margaret waited, then spoke. Mr. Caldwell, did you believe your wife would feel free to refuse signing after receiving that message? Ethan hesitated. I was under stress. That wasn't my question. Silence. Judge Holloway watched him closely. No, Ethan said finally. Margaret nodded again. Thank you. She took one step back. Now, let's talk about concealment. Ethan's head snapped up. I didn't conceal. Margaret raised one hand. Not to stop him, to signal patience. Mr. Caldwell, she said, on April 2nd, did you purchase a hardware wallet capable of storing cryptocurrency? Yes. Where is that wallet currently stored? Ethan hesitated longer this time. Margaret waited. Judge Holloway waited. The courtroom waited. In a safety deposit box, Ethan said. Which bank? Chase. Midtown branch. Margaret nodded. And the funds stored on that wallet, approximately how much? Ethan exhaled sharply. About $2 million. A ripple moved through the room. Margaret's voice didn't change. Were those funds disclosed in your affidavit? No. Judge Holloway sat back. Mr. Caldwell, she said quietly, you understand that failure to disclose assets under oath constitutes perjury. Ethan nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Margaret leaned forward slightly. One final question, Mr. Caldwell. Ethan looked at her. Why did you mock your wife for not having a lawyer? Ethan blinked. What? Why did you mock her? Silence. The question wasn't legal. It was structural. Ethan shifted. I didn't think she'd fight. Margaret nodded slowly. So you assumed weakness? Yes. You assumed silence meant submission. Ethan didn't answer. Margaret didn't press. She turned back to the judge. No further questions. She sat. The room exhaled collectively, like people surfacing after being underwater too long. Judge Holloway removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Mr. Hale, she said, you're cross. Richard stood slowly. He didn't look at Ethan. He didn't look at Margaret. He looked at the bench. Your Honor, he said carefully, given the testimony just provided, I would request a brief recess to confer with my client. Judge Holloway's gaze remained on Ethan. No. Richard's shoulders stiffened. Your Honor. No. She turned to Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, she said, you've admitted to asset concealment. coercion in the execution of marital agreement, and failure to disclose material financial information under oath. Ethan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Judge Holloway looked back to Margaret. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "do you wish to call another witness?" Margaret stood. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned slightly. "I call Richard Hale." The room went completely still. Ethan turned sharply. "What?" Richard's face drained of color. Judge Holloway's eyes snapped to him. "Mr. Hale," she said, "approach the stand." Richard hesitated, then stood. Ethan stared at him, realization dawning too late. The third flashback landed. Short, surgical. A memory of Ethan laughing in his office weeks ago, telling a colleague, "Lawyers are tools. They don't bleed." Back in the present. Richard Hale stepped toward the witness stand, jaw tight, eyes forward. Judge Holloway leaned back. The structure had fully shifted now. This was no longer about Claire Caldwell surviving a divorce. It was about Ethan Caldwell losing everything he thought protected him. And the court had only just begun. Richard Hale had spent 22 years ensuring he never sat where he was now. The witness chair faced the room in a way no conference table ever did. No strategic angles. No allies close enough to whisper. Just exposure. Just record. Just consequence. He adjusted his tie once before sitting, a reflex more than a choice. Ethan Caldwell watched him with disbelief sharpening into something colder. "You can't do this," Ethan muttered. Richard didn't look at him. The bailiff administered the oath. Richard raised his hand. "I do." Margaret Whitmore remained still for a beat after he sat. She didn't rush the moment. She allowed the discomfort to settle, to spread, to make itself useful. Then she spoke. "Mr. Hale, how long have you represented Mr. Caldwell?" Richard's voice was controlled. "Approximately 4 years." "During that time, did you advise him on financial disclosures related to this divorce?" "Yes." "Did you instruct him to fully and truthfully disclose all assets under oath?" "Yes." Margaret nodded. "So you advised compliance?" "Yes." "And yet," Margaret continued, "your client admitted a moment ago to concealing offshore funds, cryptocurrency holdings, and corporate transfers that were not disclosed in his affidavit." Richard's jaw tightened. "Yes." Judge Holloway watched closely now. Margaret took a step forward. "Mr. Hale, when did you first become aware of Northwind Capital Group?" Richard hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than a second. It was enough. "Earlier this year," he said. "How early?" "January." "And when did you become aware of the Cayman Islands account?" Richard swallowed. "March." Margaret's voice remained level. "And did you instruct your client to disclose those accounts?" "Yes." "Did he?" "No." "Did you amend the affidavit to reflect that omission?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "Answer the question, Mr. Hale." "No," Richard said quietly. Margaret didn't react. She opened a folder and removed a single email. "Mr. Hale," she said, holding it up, "do you recognize this communication?" Richard's eyes flicked to the page. "Yes." "Would you like me to read it aloud?" "No." Judge Holloway raised an eyebrow. "Read it." Margaret read. "Let's wait and see if this comes up. If it doesn't, no reason to complicate things. Sent from Richard Hale to Ethan Caldwell, March 18th, 9:42 p.m. The room shifted. Ethan's head snapped toward Richard. "What the hell is that?" Ethan whispered. Richard didn't look at him. Margaret lowered the page. "Mr. Hale," she said calmly, "why did you advise your client to delay disclosure of marital assets?" Richard's throat moved. "I didn't advise delay. I advised assessment." "Assessment of what?" "Risk." Margaret nodded. "Risk to whom?" Richard exhaled. "My client." Judge Holloway's expression hardened. Margaret continued. "Mr. Hale, are you aware that advising a client to conceal assets constitutes professional misconduct?" "Yes." "And are you aware that it may constitute aiding and abetting perjury?" "Yes." Margaret closed the folder. No further questions. The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones. This wasn't anticipation. It was recognition. Judge Holloway removed her glasses slowly. "Mr. Hale," she said, voice low, "you are an officer of this court. Yes, Your Honor. You are obligated to uphold the integrity of this process. Yes, you have failed." Richard's shoulders dropped, just slightly. Judge Holloway turned to Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you are no longer benefiting from competent counsel." Ethan's mouth opened. "That's not—" Judge Holloway raised a hand. "Mr. Hale, I am referring this testimony to the disciplinary committee effective immediately." Richard nodded once. "I understand." Ethan stood abruptly. "You're just going to let her do this?" he snapped, voice cracking for the first time. The bailiff stepped closer. Judge Holloway didn't raise her voice. "Sit down." Ethan remained standing half a second longer than he should have, then sat. Margaret didn't look at him. She turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "at this time, given the plaintiff's admissions and counsel's testimony, we are requesting immediate interim relief." Judge Holloway folded her hands. "State your request." Margaret raised one finger. "Immediate freeze of all accounts held by Ethan Caldwell, Northwind Capital Group, and any associated entities." Second finger. "Exclusive use and occupancy of the marital residence for my client." Third finger. "An appointment of a forensic auditor to trace all undisclosed assets." Judge Holloway didn't hesitate. "Granted." The word landed like a verdict. Ethan's breath left him in a sharp exhale. "No," he said. "You can't." Judge Holloway's gaze was steady. "I can, and I just did." She continued, voice firm. "Mr. Caldwell, you will surrender control of all financial instruments by close of business today." Ethan's hands clenched. Judge Holloway looked back to Margaret. "Anything further?" Margaret nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." She turned to Ethan. "I would like to address the mockery." Ethan looked up sharply. "The what?" "The behavior," Margaret said. "The contempt." She faced the judge again. "Your Honor, my client was mocked in open court for not having a lawyer. That mockery was strategic. It was designed to humiliate her and pressure her into submission." Judge Holloway's jaw tightened. Margaret continued, "Humiliation is not evidence, but it is relevant." She turned slightly, addressing the room now, because it reveals intent. Ethan shook his head. "This is ridiculous." Margaret's voice stayed calm. Mr. Caldwell believed the absence of counsel meant absence of resistance. She looked at him directly. "You mistook silence for weakness." Ethan laughed brittle. "She wouldn't survive without me." The words slipped out before he could stop them. The courtroom went still. Judge Holloway stared at him. "Mr. Caldwell," she said slowly, "did you just say your wife would not survive without you?" Ethan hesitated. Margaret didn't move. The fourth flashback hit. Climactic timing approaching, but not yet landing. A memory of Claire standing in their kitchen, voice quiet, saying she wanted to handle something herself. Ethan laughing. "You need me for everything." Back in the present. The words echoed in his ears. Judge Holloway leaned forward. "That statement," she said, "will be noted." Margaret turned back to her seat. Claire sat very still. Her hands were no longer clenched. They rested open on the table. The room felt different now. The power had moved. Judge Holloway banged the gavel once. "We will recess for 15 minutes. As people stood, Ethan remained seated. Richard Hale avoided his gaze as he stepped away from the stand. Already a man separated himself from a sinking structure. Margaret leaned toward Claire for the first time. Not to console, to confirm. "We're past the point of negotiation," she said quietly. Claire nodded. "I know." Outside the courtroom, murmurs erupted. Phones came out. Names were typed. Messages sent. For the first time that day, he wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about exposure. And somewhere beneath that, he felt the first real thing he'd felt in years. Fear. The hallway outside Courtroom 14 befilled slowly, cautiously, like people approaching the edge of something they weren't sure they wanted to look over. Ethan Caldwell stood apart from everyone else. Not physically, There wasn't enough space for that, but socially, conversations bent around him without touching. Eyes slid past him as if he'd already become inconvenient, already radioactive. A few minutes earlier, those same people would have nodded, smiled, recognized a name. Now they avoided him. Richard Hale stood near the far wall. Phone pressed his ear, voice low, urgent. He wasn't arguing. He wasn't negotiating. He was surviving. Margaret Whitmore sat on a bench beside Claire, legs crossed, posture composed. She wasn't reviewing documents. She wasn't whispering strategy. She was waiting. Waiting was her advantage. Claire stared at the opposite wall, watching the seal of the courthouse reflected faintly in the glass of a framed notice. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had passed. Something else had taken its place. Something quieter and heavier. Ethan paced. 3 steps forward. Turn. 3 steps back. He stopped in front of Margaret. "This isn't over," he said, voice low but tight. "You think you can walk in here and dismantle my life in one morning?" Margaret looked up at him. Her expression didn't change. "Mr. Caldwell," she said evenly, "your life dismantled itself. I'm just documenting it." Ethan scoffed. "You think you've won." Margaret rose slowly, meeting him at eye level. "I don't think in terms of winning," she said. "I think in terms of outcome." Ethan leaned closer. "You don't know what I'm capable of." Margaret didn't step back. "I know exactly what you're capable of," she replied. "That's why this is necessary." The bailiff opened the courtroom doors. All parties back inside. The room reassembled faster this time. No idle chatter. No board shifting. Everyone knew something final was coming. Judge Holloway returned to the bench and didn't waste time. "Be seated." She adjusted her glasses, then looked directly at Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell, before we proceed, I want to be very clear." Her voice was calm, but it carried. "You are now under formal scrutiny for perjury, financial concealment, and potential coercive conduct." Ethan swallowed. Judge Holloway continued. "This court does not tolerate litigants who weaponize process." She turned to Margaret. "Ms. Whitmore, you indicated you had additional matters to raise." Margaret stood. "Yes, Your Honor." She didn't move toward the center this time. She stayed beside Claire. "This court has addressed financial misconduct. We've addressed professional misconduct. What remains is character." Richard Hale shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Ethan stiffened. Margaret turned slightly. "Your Honor," I call Samantha Reed. Ethan's head snapped up. "No," he said softly. "You wouldn't." The doors opened again. A woman in her early 30s stepped inside. She wore a modest gray dress and carried herself like someone who hadn't slept well in weeks. Her eyes scanned the room once, landed on Ethan, and immediately looked away. She took the stand. The oath was administered. Judge Holloway nodded. "Proceed." Margaret's voice softened, not emotionally, but tactically. "Ms. Reed, can you state your relationship to Mr. Caldwell?" Samantha inhaled shakily. "I was involved with him for about a year." Ethan shook his head slowly, disbelief giving way to dread. Margaret continued. "During that time, did Mr. Caldwell speak to you about his wife?" Samantha hesitated, then nodded. "All the time." "What did he say?" "That she was useless. That she didn't contribute anything. That she'd be nothing without him." Claire closed her eyes. Ethan's voice cut in. "This is irrelevant." Judge Holloway's gaze snapped to him. "It's not." Samantha continued, words spilling faster now. "He told me he controlled everything. The money, the house, the lawyers. He said he was going to leave her with nothing so she'd finally understand how much she needed him." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Margaret didn't react. "Did he ever discuss this courtroom?" "Yes," Samantha said. "He said today would be fun to watch." The words landed heavily. Judge Holloway leaned back. Margaret nodded once. No further questions. She turned slightly. "Cross-examination?" Richard Hale remained seated. He didn't look at Ethan. "No questions, Your Honor." Judge Holloway removed her glasses again. "Ms. Reed," she said, "you may step down." Samantha left the stand without looking back. Ethan stared straight ahead, jaw locked. Judge Holloway folded her hands. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you have demonstrated a pattern of behavior that extends beyond financial misconduct." She paused. "This court is issuing an immediate temporary order." The room went still. "Effective immediately, all marital assets are frozen. Exclusive possession of all real property is granted to Ms. Caldwell." Ethan's breath hitched. "Additionally," Judge Holloway continued, "this court is referring this matter to the district attorney for review of potential criminal charges related to perjury, fraud, and coercion." Richard Hale closed his eyes. Ethan stood abruptly. "This is insane," he said, voice rising. "You can't do this based on—" The bailiff moved. Judge Holloway didn't raise her voice. "Sit down." Ethan sat. Judge Holloway looked at Margaret. "Ms. Whitmore, anything further?" Margaret considered for a moment. "Yes, Your Honor." She stepped forward. "One final clarification." She turned to Ethan. "You mocked your wife for having no lawyer," she said. "You thought the absence of counsel meant the absence of protection." She let the silence stretch. "The record should reflect that your assumption was incorrect." Judge Holloway nodded once. "So noted." She raised the gavel. "This hearing is adjourned. Final rulings will follow." The sound of the gavel echoed. People stood slowly, quietly. Claire remained seated for a moment longer. Margaret placed a hand lightly on the table beside her. Not touching, just present. "We're done here," she said. Claire stood. Ethan watched them gather their things. "Claire," he said hoarsely, "please." Claire looked at him, not with anger, not with triumph, with distance. "I don't speak to you through intimidation anymore," she said quietly. Margaret stepped between them. "My daughter is finished explaining herself," she said. They walked past him. The courtroom doors closed behind them. Ethan stood alone at the table. The fifth flashback hit, brief, brutal. A memory of him laughing weeks earlier, saying, "If she ever tried to fight me, I'd crush her." Back in the present. The words felt foreign, because now there was nothing left to crush. And the realization settled in slowly, painfully. The power he'd relied on had already moved on without him. If you enjoy the story and are interested in the next part of this story, let us know in the comments and we will make available on the channel. But make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you can get notified